I was recently looking at some stats that had been sent to me by a friend regarding Japan, specifically regarding the so-called reproductive situation there. And the stats go something like this. Over two-thirds of Japanese people aged 20 to 24 aren't dating, and nearly half of those don't even want to. And at least in 2015, and the numbers have probably shot up since then, 42% of Japanese men and 44% of Japanese women age 18 to 34 have never had sex, including a quarter of the 30 to 34-year-old men and a third of the 30 to 34-year-old women. And of course, there are other stats that bear this out, and some of them, when they're interviewed, say that they're not interested and they even despise the idea of having sex. And there are a lot of interesting parallels, but also differences between the ongoing development in the West with respect to what I call the reproductive underground, and I call it for a specific reason, which I'll get into in a bit, and the reproductive underground of Japan. Now, what do I mean by reproductive underground? Well, specifically, I mean the things that are never talked about in the mainstream, which is to say, in a very real sense, there's a reproductive crisis. I'm not referring to low birth rates, although that's everyone's favorite pet peeve these days, but more the general lack of access and the general lack of viability of male-female relationships in the post-modern world, or whichever version of the world we happen to live in these days. And it is the reproductive underground because it simply doesn't get a lot of air. If you were to go by mainstream impressions, you would get the sense that everything's peachy keen, everything is fine, and things are working as intended, to quote God Howard, the Legend of Bethesda, but with respect to reproduction between men and women instead of games. But the issue is that there actually is a burgeoning force beneath the surface of all of this that is very real and very consequential, I think, ultimately. That is that in some cases, this extreme case in Japan, nearly half the population is, for a variety of reasons that we can go into, shut out of the reproductive game. And we don't know what the numbers are in the West, but I suspect they're increasing quite rapidly. And the mainstream media are remiss in not reporting on this and not talking about. Yes, they'll talk about plummeting birth rates. Some people do that. And again, that's a popular topic. But this isn't about just having children. This is about the very fundamentals of things. And what I'd like to do is compare and contrast Japan with the West. Now, of course, I'm not an expert on Japan, but I do know a little bit, and I have lived in South Korea. And I want to first address why you're getting these strange numbers in Japan. Well, for one thing, Japan is a very different place from the West. It's culturally, historically, and genetically distinct from the West. And all these things converge, and you end up with a very different outcome. And so, one thing I'd comment on Japan is that Japan does not, in contrast to the West, have a kind of raging sex culture. Everything is a lot more subdued. Yes, there's a lot of crazy stuff that goes on behind the scenes, hentai, tentacle porn, that sort of thing. But it is not, based on my impressions, nearly as in-your-face and constant and obsessive as is the West about these things. So one thing we can note here is that when people are doing self-reporting, which, as I've said many times, is very unreliable, but they're openly admitting to these things, it tells you something. What would be the incentive to lie about this? Clearly, it's not an issue in Japan of feeling shame or embarrassment at not having had sex or not having had partners or relationships or whatever. Whereas, imagine trying to do the same thing in the West. Frankly, I don't think anyone would answer honestly, or the few people that did would be far and few between. So that's a difference right there. Japanese culture is a shame-based culture, but this is not something for which people feel much shame, apparently. And again, in the West, everything is predicated, especially when you're young, on your sexual success. So the minute you become a teenager, it all becomes relevant, and it becomes nearly essential to quest after this. Also, another thing you might notice is that it seems very unlikely in the West that you would find this skew where females are actually having less sex than men. I'm fairly certain that's not the case. In the West, there's a different procedure. It's not that women really eschew relationships. They typically go through a whole bunch and end up very disappointed and unhappy at the end of it when they hit the wall. In the case of Japan, obviously it looks different. They're not even bothering, and it doesn't really interest them, and it interests them even less than the men. There's another aspect here that I think is important to touch upon, and that is the aspect of social dysfunction. Yes, some of these people, these so-called hikikomori or herbivore men and women in Japan, might be regarded as socially dysfunctional, but they are not regarded in the same way that people who lack reproductive success in the West are regarded. Because in the West, if you have not had success in these domains, you're regarded as some of the worst filth of society. You're not worthy of attention, you're not worthy of being listened to. And it's the youngest generation, I think, that is most hit by this, the Zoomers, although there are definitely some millennials as well. And so there's a different social valence with respect to that. Again, there seems to be a very profound difference in the way the Japanese are willing to talk about this versus, say, the United States, or really anywhere in the West. And yes, long term, this can lead to plummeting birth rates and worries about below replacement level, which again is a common theme for many people. But my major concern is what the social repercussions are. How does this all work out? And how does this play out in different ways, say, in Japan versus, say, the United States? I think, in general, these things are going to remain very calm, very mollified in Japan. I don't suspect, for example, that you will hear so much as a peep from these people. They're very quiet typically, and they will just get on with their lives and probably do so for the rest of their lives. Whereas I think this burgeoning growth of reproductive frustration in the West is going to be far more consequential simply because of the differences between the West and Japan in terms of history, culture, etc. So in the West, I think we're already seeing this. We're seeing a lot of what's called sexual frustration, and the fact that it's never even talked about is interesting. And to the extent that it is, it's always blame the men. We've already heard this a million times, right? It's always something along the lines of men can't find good enough jobs, so they suck, and they're hurting women because employment opportunities are not that great. And of course, it's the men's fault. And so it's always this refrain of blame the man, blame the man, blame the man. Now, I've talked about this before, but one of the key differences between older men who decide to go their own way versus younger men is typically older men have some experience dealing with the opposite sex, some experience going through the rigmarole, the motions. And it's only really through this experience that they can arrive at the conclusion that the juice is famously not worth the squeeze and it's just not worth bothering with any of this stuff, ultimately. For a young person, for a young guy, it's a lot harder to convince him. For one thing, he's in the prime of his life. He's bathing and basking in his hormones. But also, it's difficult to convince people, if they've never tried something, that that thing is, in fact, probably not worth it. Because they have to go through the experience themselves. It's only through accumulation of experience can one gauge whether or not something's worth it or not. Sure, you can listen to other people, but ultimately that typically rings hollow, and people don't like following the advice of people without having experienced it themselves. The worst vice is advice, famously. And so ultimately, I think what's going to be happening, both in Japan but also in the West, is you're going to see a lot more social dysfunction, specifically in the West now. You're going to see a lot more depression, a lot more substance abuse, a lot more of all of these things that are going to be used in lieu of experiences that used to be typical or prototypical for people generations or decades ago. Remember, this is the era of Tinder. This is the era of TikTok. Everything is bigger and flashier, and no one is locked down to his locality. What do I mean by that? You might come from Topeka, Kansas. You might be in the middle of the country, not very populated area, but whether you like it or not, you also live on the internet. And even though there might only be a couple of guys and a couple of girls in Topeka, Kansas, you nonetheless have this issue that the internet is there, they have access to it, and this will modulate their brains and it will change the way people view each other. This is the inevitability of technology in general, but specifically this sort of technology, which, frankly speaking, we never really thought about the consequences of. We just kind of put it out there and it just happened and worked, and so we were just sort of cruising along, seeing what might happen in the future. And I also don't think that if mainstream media did pay attention to this, it would really make much of a difference. They're not going to change the dynamics of the new market. This is increasingly a world of the haves and the have-nots. The people who have money and the people who have very little. People who have sex and the people who have no sex. The people who have relationships and the people who have never had relationships, and so on and so forth. And what is going to happen, I think, is that you're going to get what we already can sort of observe, parallel societies of people who might as well be aliens to each other, but in every respect, not just in terms of wealth, not just in terms of education, but also in terms of fundamental human experience. But in Japan, in contrast to the West, I don't think you're going to see a lot of unrest. I don't think you're going to see a lot of rabble rousers. In the West, though, it's entirely possible. What could be done is for serious, committed academics who are not going to go down the PC route necessarily to look at the data, look at the numbers, analyze, examine what's going on, and maybe think long-term about what some of the results of this will be. Because all we ever do is put these technologies out on the market and just hope for the best. And we never think about the consequences of this and what happened. Because rest assured, this would be vastly different without the internet. If we had continued from, say, 1980 to the current year without the internet, without all of this stuff, the world would have been very different indeed. And I don't think you'd see this level of dysfunction and this level of social caste formation to the same degree, if at all. Anyway, thanks for checking out the video. Do hit the like button, subscribe if you've not yet done so. Please hit the bell icon to be informed of the forthcoming videos. Share the video. And if I'm still alive, I'll check you out later. May the gods watch over you. Take care. Bye-bye. If you liked this video, please like, share, and subscribe. And if you enjoy my content, please consider making a donation or becoming a patron. Thanks for watching.